Hello, welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. This time we have Ben back for another interview, and we're going to be speaking about the Socratic method and logic and argumentation. So hello, Ben. Welcome back to our series. It's good to have you again.
Hi, Ryan. Good to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on this again.
So yeah, as you know, we the past couple sessions we've been talking about the Socratic method, a little bit about Socrates himself, and then looking at the basics of logic and argumentation. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak on those two topics a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, we've talked about the Socratic method actually in quite a bit of depth, which was excellent. I think the Socratic method is a wonderful thing for people to internalize, not only for conversations they might have with others, but also internalizing it for themselves and the way they speak with themselves. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or anything you'd like to add regarding the Socratic method, the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of it, and then, of course, how you can implement it in your own life.
Absolutely. For me personally, I was interested in the Socratic method kind of early when I was in graduate school because it seemed like as a methodology, it was very useful and comparable to something like conceptual analysis that is often very common in analytic philosophy today. So, for example, if we take a concept like justice, for instance, that's either ill-defined or vague or often means different things depending on the situations or contexts. I think the Socratic method is really good to kind of explicate and try to understand what that term is, kind of break it into like necessary and sufficient conditions. And I think that's a little bit like what Socrates was doing when he was in the marketplace and he would ask his interlocutor about different terms that are important philosophically, that often meant different things to different people. And so he really wanted to formulate a definition. And by doing so, he could pursue knowledge of what that term meant. I think that was kind of his goal.
I'm reading a book by Ward Farnsworth right now titled The Socratic Method. I don't know if you've encountered it or read it, and it's been an incredible read. But just to support what you just said is, we didn't talk about this in the series, but one of the kind of moves that Socrates makes is they call it the elenchus, right? And that's the moment of something like refutation, or you reveal the contradiction in your person's thinking. And then Farnsworth does a really good job of like, well, how do you actually implement the elenchus in conversation? And he says, people will present like something that they want to talk about, and your goal as the Socrates in the conversation is to find the concept or the ruling definition or assumption behind it, right? So you'll get something very specific, and then you have to find the general principle ruling it. As an example, I think it's is it Lakey's? I can't remember if it's the Lakey's. They're talking about the nature of courage, and the first thing that someone asks is like, should my son wear armor when training or something? And it's like in the context of courage. And Socrates is like, well, what's behind this question? And they totally like just go away from the specifics, and he takes them to the concept. So yeah, maybe if you wouldn't mind, could you speak a little bit more about what concept analysis is and how it might vary from the Socratic method?
Yeah, so in the 21st century in analytic philosophy, there was this method which is just called conceptual analysis. And oftentimes this kind of organically was created through the philosophy of language. And through kind of an analysis of language, concepts were thought to have certain kinds of definitions. And those definitions needed to be understood in order to fully understand and have knowledge of a concept. So one way to think about this is that there were a lot of vague, ill-defined, and poorly understood concepts that were used different ways. And really through kind of the interest of Wittgenstein's philosophy, wanted to kind of understand what those concepts actually mean. And so the goal then for analytic philosophers was to try to understand not just the meaning, but how that term was used, because use doesn't always equate to meaning. It may be used in certain ways, but then it may mean something entirely different. So I think one of the differences, like you said, in kind of conversing with other individuals. Looking at Socrates' dialogues, is that he wanted to kind of take a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach, where he would ask questions, like you said, that were very kind of general or broad, and he would ask individuals to try to define them. One of the assumptions here is, of course, that there are these presuppositions that we make in our conversations about the definition or about what a term means, that we think we know. Right? For example, if I say something like, I think I know a dog is an animal, that's furry, has 4 legs, for example, somebody might try to refute that definition and say, well, what about this dog that doesn't have hair, or a dog that only has 2 legs, right? It lost its other legs, for instance. Is that still a dog? And then Plato came along and he tried to introduce his universals as a way to kind of understand like the essence of certain kinds of definitions. And that's a little bit more abstract, but he thought that there were universals that objects, particulars, participate in the forms of those universals. So it was kind of a method that might have adopted Socrates' approach and formalized it in a way that became a little bit more rigorous in terms of like a fully fleshed out metaphysics of universals. But yeah, I mean, there are different ways to talk about the Socratic method, but, as simple as possible, if I were to distill it for somebody who's listening to this right now, who's never encountered it before, it's a method of inquiry that attempts to understand the assumptions that we make by, instead of putting forth your own thesis or your own perspective or your own opinion in an argument, you ask others what their opinions are, and you offer counter arguments, and you try to refute and come up with a different kind of definition than they originally started with.
Definitely, testing principles and things. And I mean, I think is it the Theaetetus or the Timaeus? One of them, Socrates says he's a gadfly, or he's like a nurse mother or something. He's just here to support your ideas, but to incubate them in the right ways, right? Which means using logic and argumentation to make sure that they're as solid as possible, but oftentimes he just pokes holes in them. But
yeah, what's interesting though is that there were critics who accused him of being a sophist. For example, sophists are individuals who often would receive pay to persuade. Think of them as a little bit like teachers today that taught individuals how to speak eloquently by using rhetoric to persuade individuals. Modern day, lawyers, I think are comparable to a certain respect. They may not necessarily be concerned about what's true, but rather they want to persuade. Socrates was quite the opposite of the sophist, though, right? I mean, he wanted to understand what was true rather than necessarily just persuade, right? He wanted to reflect, and if that meant, for example, recognizing that even he himself didn't understand something, then that might be the ultimate goal of Elenchus. Yeah, one thing I might say also about Socrates that's kind of interesting too is this state that often in a lot of these dialogues end in this kind of state called aporia. Aporia is this state of kind of like bewilderment, right? Where often individuals who are engaging in a dialogue kind of realize that they both don't know what this definition might be or what the meaning of this term might be, and simply just give up. And so it's kind of an interesting state in methodology of using the Socratic method, because in a way it's kind of a goal, one might say, that the Socratic method is a useful tool because we can end in that state, and that even makes us even more curious to want to know what that concept or what that term might be.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up aporia. So I kind of want to throw a bit of a curveball at you, and it might be a little bit higher level than entry level Socratic method, but in the literature around the Socratic method, and of course we don't have to get into that, but around the literature on this, there is that question that you were alluding to of like, is the Socratic method largely a critical or destructive enterprise? So it's always meant to refute and to break down? Or is there something to be had when it comes to building or securing or protecting knowledge? So is there any constructive side to the Socratic method?
That's a really interesting question. I'd say that it's a methodology. It's a tool, right? And it can be used in a variety of different ways, depending on who's using it. If educators are using the Socratic method, for example, then the goal would be to teach, right? If a lawyer were in court and they were using the Socratic method, the goal might be quite different. The Socratic method's used in law schools, for example, to teach and help individuals understand concepts. So I think, in a way, as a pedagogical or andragogical tool, the goal is to further knowledge, to further one's inquiry into understanding and evaluating their hidden assumptions that they might make. So its goal isn't necessarily to refute or disagree. And I think that's really what differentiates, the Socratic method that's used by Socrates from somebody like a sophist, right? The sophist might think of the goal of an argument is to win, right? But that's not what Socrates thinks at all. He doesn't think that the ultimate goal is to win. This isn't a debate. I often hear that, Socrates was debating, but it's not really a debate. Debating is about persuading using rhetoric. It isn't necessarily about arriving at the truth necessarily. You might use rhetoric to persuade individuals, to appeal to one's emotions, and not necessarily use logos to enhance one's argument. So I think that ultimately here, Socrates was interested in trying to understand what was true. And maybe that's just because he's a philosopher. It was kind of in his character to want to ask these kinds of questions. Not necessarily to always arrive at truths. In fact, he was obviously unsatisfied and continued to ask questions, but he did have that insatiable curiosity and wanted to ask further questions.
Something that I asked you, not on the series, but in private, I asked you what Socrates' theory of truth is, because he, of course, professes this, or Plato writes about this, that, Socrates is distinct from someone that's just out there being a troll, in that he is pursuing the truth. But then I think a fair question is, well, what the hell is the truth? And, that's a massive question. So I don't know if we can address that, but I had an idea and I want to float it by you. Do you think that Socrates would accept that a definition of the truth is that which can't be refuted?
That's interesting. I think that Socrates probably would not necessarily want to accept that, probably because he would counter and say that there could be truths that, have been refuted throughout history. You'd offer a counter argument and suggest that throughout history, there have been refutations, right? And probably would be, counter to that. But I don't think he's offering a theory of truth necessarily, but rather I think he is offering kind of more of a understanding of wisdom, doing epistemology rather than thinking that truth is a necessary condition for knowing, right? So when we think of like truth, in the Meno, for example, Plato offers a theory of truth, for instance, and this is kind of developing a justified true belief, right? Coming up with a definition of knowledge that's based on truth. But for Socrates, though, it doesn't seem like he's thinking about a definition of truth or a theory of truth. When we think of theories of truths, I might think of something like, the correspondence theory of truth, right? Or a coherence theory of truth. I'd probably say that Socrates is probably more aligned with the coherence theory of truth, though, that he wants to look for a set of propositions that are logically consistent, that are coherent. But I don't think he's independently offering a theory of truth necessarily.
Yeah, that's good. And for listeners, we will be going over these theories of truth because they're, of course, very important when it comes to critical thinking. Eventually, I was making the joke throughout the series, given the way that we presented the material, we eventually just had to address logic and argumentation, and this will eventually be necessary in this series when it comes to truth. We're just going to have to kind of headbutt that, for better or for worse, and try our best in an introductory series to say something about truth. But on that topic, I thought maybe we could switch now to logic and argumentation. Still in the spirit of Socrates, I tried to present Socrates in a way where, charitably in a way where it sometimes felt like Socrates would be leading people towards a conclusion that he wanted. And I tried to argue or demonstrate or show that really all Socrates was doing was guiding the people he was talking to in a specific direction, not for a specific answer, but in line with a set of rules. So he didn't mind where the conversation went as long as it followed a set of rules. And those rules are logic and argumentation. So yeah, maybe we can just begin by speaking a little bit about what logic and argumentation is, specifically through the thought of Socrates and the Socratic method.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked that question kind of in the spirit of argumentation, because the way I define an argument is it's a statement that's supported by some kind of reason or evidence, right? Very simple. But with Socrates, he's asking interrogative statements, right? He's asking questions. So they're not, and arguments themselves, because they consist of, a claim, which is basically your conclusion, or some would argue it's a thesis, like in a paper, for example, that has to be a declarative statement, right? Because it's a reasoned proposition. But when Socrates puts forth his interrogative statement, because he's asking a question, he's not actually making an argument. In fact, he's asking individuals to make arguments themselves. And I think that's kind of the utility of this Socratic method, because it allows individuals to reflect and and construct their own reasons, and even think consciously about their own reasons by analyzing their justification, right? So for example, if I said that, what is a dog? You might reply, well, a dog is a, furry animal with 4 legs, right? That's an argument, right? I'm putting forth reasons for believing that. But then if I reject that and I say, well, what about a 2-legged animal? Is that a dog? Or it doesn't have fur, right? Is that still a dog? You might become more consciously aware of your reasoning, right? Because then you want to reformulate that original definition. That's kind of like your thesis. And then you have this antithesis, or your antithesis, which is kind of a way to refute or create a counter-argument, and then you synthesize that, right? That's philosophical dialectic. That's kind of a tool that we often see is used to kind of promote critical thinking, to become consciously aware of our reasoning and our justification.
Yeah, that you used the key word that Socrates himself used, which is dialectic, right? So he was not after debate. As you said, the sophists were, and with the intent of winning, he was having a dialectic. And dialectic is something like forwarding and testing hypotheses or claims and trying to find the ones that stand. I mean, in a way, maybe you could even say the Socratic method is like proto-scientific method, or it is the original scientific method. Like you make a claim and then you just try to refute it the best you can. And if it survives, well, then carry it to the next day.
That's an interesting way to put it, I think. Yeah, I think when individuals are formulating a hypothesis, right, it's very similar to the way that, Socrates will ask questions. If there's some kind of unknown phenomena that we're trying to explain, asking questions and formulating the best reasonable explanation for that is quite similar in a way. So
where do you think Socrates acquired or developed his understanding of logic and argumentation? That might be good to know, given the fact that really what we know about logic and argumentation today is going to come from, like Aristotle and later works in the medieval ages. And that might just be a consequence of the written record, right? But how did Socrates get so good at logic and argumentation?
That's an interesting question. To be honest with you, I don't know. I think that, he probably developed a method that he realized worked very efficiently. In fact, there's this discussion in one of Plato's dialogues, for example, where, Socrates is showing how knowledge can be a priori or innate, right? Or there's a dialogue with Socrates informing a slave boy who doesn't know anything about math, how he can know mathematics. And I think this is kind of consistent with maybe Plato's view, because he's a rationalist. Plato argued that all knowledge is innate. I think Plato probably, through maybe the influence of Socrates, recognized that, logic is itself something that can be learned through examples, through experience, because it's this innate skill that can be honed through practice. But I don't know if he actually had any experiences in his life where he was encountering formal logic. There were some, pre-Socratics, for example, that developed very kind of rudimentary logic, but was later, obviously modified through the development of, early Stoics, for example, or the Aristotelian logic that we're familiar with, the categorical logic, with the development of syllogisms. But it's an interesting kind of question about how Socrates learned logic.
Was he, do you know, I don't know if this is important, but was he a sophist? Wasn't he trained as a sophist originally and broke off from that, or am I making this up?
I don't know if that's true, because oftentimes there would be individuals who would accuse Socrates of being a sophist, but I don't think he was formally trained in sophistry. Sophistry kind of developed during that time because it became more of like a paid profession. It was an occupation for individuals to teach others how to speak eloquently, or public speaking, for example, was a skill that was very useful. And as you can imagine, the democratic society that Socrates lived in required that skill of public speaking. It was very important. So he probably, encountered that, or dialogues very early in his life, during maybe his childhood, because he witnessed others speak publicly about political matters.
So it would have been sort of just built into his culture and his upbringing, sort of the way that we all generally know how to use social media and things. He would have been trained or understood by osmosis how to have a conversation and to give a speech, to be in order, right? And then you've got the piece, though, that sets him apart from the sophists, of course, is that, like you said, a sophist's goal is to convince, and he had a problem with that. In fact, something that I've learned reading Farnsworth is Socrates, the thing that really seemed to irritate him, and you can get this in the dialogues, is he didn't like people that claimed to know something that they actually didn't know. And that's the people that's the people that got his wrath. He would just tear them apart. And the term for that is double ignorance, when you truly believe you know something that you actually don't. And so the Socratic method, in that sense, if you're in that position and you encounter a Socrates or the Socratic method, it can be extremely humbling,
Yeah, I think so. One thing, though, that really sets Socrates apart, I think, that from other figures throughout history too, in this regard, is that he claimed to be motivated by a daimon, right, or a demon. Literal translation, not like we think of like a conscience, like the angel and devil on your shoulder. He actually thought that he was motivated by this kind of internal voice. And interestingly enough, we don't often think about this too, but Socrates is actually quite religious at the time too. He did believe in the gods of Athens. And so in a way, he was kind of spiritually motivated to ask questions, to reveal the truth. So it was a kind of internal theological or moral obligation that he believed he had to find out and uncover the truth. And you're right. I think it's irritating for him that there were a lot of individuals within the Athenian society who professed to know certain things and clearly did not. If you're, for example, a military general, like, I think it's Thrasymachus, right? He wanted to use power and thought he understood what justice was, but that was problematic. And Socrates recognized that there were a lot of political officials, people in positions of power who claimed to know things, but really didn't know them. And I think, Socrates being the gadfly that he was, it was necessary for him to kind of understand and act like a philosophical midwife for a lot of these folks. But of course that made them pretty angry, right? And you're being questioned and you are using your authority to make claims about certain things that were just simply not true.
Yeah, a great dialogue that Ben and I actually refer to in our course that we teach at Nightingale College is the Euthyphro. So if anyone listening wants to just get a very short, quick introduction to the wonders and the irritations of encountering Socrates, that would be the Euthyphro. It's a great dialogue to start with, to just really begin to understand what this whole method is about.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the Euthyphro dilemma is a great starting place to understand Socrates. And, the character Socrates, there's the man and then there's the myth. It's kind of interesting because he's been mythologized, right? I mean, as a public figure, as somebody who's inspirational, philosophical savior. But the reality is he was probably very annoying. I think people didn't like him because he would confront them. And he would ask far too many questions when people were busy with their lives. And that might have irritated people enough. But, the goal, of course, was to help understand, to achieve knowledge. And so I think philosophers are inspired by him as kind of a wise sage, but somebody who's really an exemplar, somebody who a lot of philosophers want to aspire to.
Yeah, well said. The Stoics, the skeptics, all these people kind of put him on a pedestal. And I tried to address that as well in the series, I believe, is understanding like the literary Platonic Socrates and then who Socrates might have been. And, we don't have a lot of written record on who Socrates was. I do know that if you compare like Plato's Socrates and Xenophon's Socrates, they're different, right? I think the Plato Socrates is a little bit more Platonic, and that does link us up to Plato and the universal, the forms and all that. And, so it's hard to tease out like who Socrates was. That said, even in the dialogues, even in Plato's view, like Socrates wasn't infallible, so there's often a lot of times scholars have identified moments in the dialogues where Socrates is not being logical at all. Like he's really making some flubs in his own argumentation. And it's interesting to try to tease out whether or not Plato is demonstrating that either to, poke holes in Socrates' reputation or to demonstrate and to educate where, thinking can go wrong. Certainly Plato was aware that, his character wasn't being logical in the moment. I mean, he would have been aware of this. So understanding the motivation behind that's interesting. But Socrates is not a saint, as we might say today, for sure.
Yeah, that is interesting. The seeming contradictions that we see in Plato's dialogue are quite fascinating. I think there are a lot of there's a lot of scholarly discussion, I think, about what Plato's ultimate motivations were for doing something like that. But I think Socrates, if he were truly a person who was alive, who walked the streets of Athens, he would absolutely be infallible, right? No, I'm just kidding. But the thing is, he's, we don't know everything he says, right? What we know, of course, was only written in the form of dialogues after the fact. And a lot of the details aren't always there. And there are a lot of dialogues that are missing too. So historians don't fully understand who Socrates truly is.
I think on that note, it might be a good place to leave off. I always mess up my speaking. I don't know why I do this. But so thank you so much for giving us more of a background on Socrates and his method and how it links up with logic and argumentation. I wanted to just share a bit of an anecdote with you and any educators that might be listening. One of the things that I like to do that was kind of a Socratic method thing in teaching intro to philosophy is asking students to define a chair. And so you have a definition or concept of a chair. And philosophers, if there's any philosophers listening, you're hopefully laughing at this point because philosophers and chairs are really hard to separate for some reason. But you start to take pieces of the chair away. So you're like, is a chair still a chair if it doesn't have a back or if it only has 3 legs? And you keep tearing it apart until you either run out of chair or it's turned into something else, at which point you have to back up and be like, well, this is the basic definition of a chair, And so it turns out, and I didn't realize this, but it turns out there's such thing as a one-legged chair. it's a bar stool, I think, right? Or maybe a stool isn't a chair. You see what I mean? Yeah, conceptual analysis, Socratic method. It's a bit absurd.
So I guess next week we'll then talk about what a chair is then. That's the ultimate philosophical question, right?
It truly is, yes. And whether burritos and tacos are sandwiches, which, there's varying, or hot dogs, there's varying opinions on this. So these are the real questions. This is why we are putting this stuff out there. Yeah. Ben, again, thank you so much for coming on, and we will see you hopefully in another 3 lectures.
Wonderful. That sounds good. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.
And I will see you folks next time on Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us.